Educational disclaimer. This video provides independent geopolitical and economic analysis for informational purposes. It strictly adheres to YouTube community guidelines and does not promote or glorify violence. Ukraine's refineries are burning again tonight, and if you think this is just another drone strike, you're missing where the real damage is landing, because the target isn't a barracks. It's not a military installation anyone would put in a textbook as a legitimate target. It's the infrastructure that turns crude oil into the fuel that ordinary Russians and Russian logistics actually run on. And for the first time in this war, the calculus has shifted. You're not watching Ukraine try to win territory through frontal assault. You're watching them try to win economically through something closer to a supply chain stranglehold. And the mechanism behind it is something that almost nobody in Western financial press is connecting to what actually happens at gas pumps in Moscow and pricing at the pump for everyone else. That's the story underneath the headline, and it matters more than people realize. So if you want these breakdowns the moment they happen, hit subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. Let's lay this out, because the sequencing here, the deliberateness of targeting refineries specifically instead of, say, oil fields or export terminals, tells you something about Ukraine's strategic thinking that has barely been discussed and should be. 3 weeks ago, we were talking about drone strikes on military infrastructure, depots, ammunition storage, command centers, the kind of targets that have direct tactical value in a given week's fighting. But something shifted. The targeting changed. Ukrainian forces started hitting refineries. Not one, multiple. The Moscow facility, the Ryazan complex, sites that exist specifically to take crude oil and convert it into diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, the actual fuel that keeps an economy moving. And here's what makes this different from the symbolic strikes everyone was talking about. This isn't about hitting Russia's ability to make war. This is about hitting Russia's ability to keep its own economy functioning while it makes war. Let me be direct, because this distinction matters. Russia has massive crude reserves. Crude is fungible. Crude gets exported. Crude, from a sanctions perspective, has been nearly impossible to fully choke off because buyers exist, shadow fleets exist, insurance workarounds exist. Russia's export earnings have actually stayed elevated because crude itself is valuable on the global market regardless of who's selling it. But here's what crude isn't useful for. Sitting in a tank. Crude doesn't go in a car. Crude doesn't power a truck moving ammunition toward the front. Crude has to get refined. And refineries take time to build. They can't be quickly replaced. They can't be easily substituted. One facility going offline doesn't just lose you that facility's output. It means every drop of crude that would have gone through that facility now has to go somewhere else, and everywhere else is already running near capacity. So when Ukrainian planners look at this problem, they're not seeing an oil industry. They're seeing a bottleneck, a specific, targetable, difficult to replace bottleneck, and that changes everything about the kind of pressure they can build. Here's the mechanism, because the mechanism is the story. Russia refines something close to 3.2 million barrels a day domestically. That number varies, but it's in that range. Of that refined output, Moscow and the surrounding region consume roughly 1 million barrels a day, maybe slightly under. That's fuel for civilian transport, for logistics, for the military supply lines that feed everything from Crimea to the front lines in Ukraine. One major refinery, say the Moscow facility, historically supplies something in the range of 20 to 30% of that regional demand. A third, one facility. So what happens when that facility takes a direct hit and its processing units get damaged badly enough that it has to shut down for weeks or months of repairs? You can't just reroute that volume to another refinery on short notice. Refineries are connected to specific pipelines, specific distribution networks. They're not interchangeable. You can't just take 1 million barrels a day meant for one facility and pipe it to 5 others. The infrastructure doesn't work that way. So what you get instead is a genuine shortage in the region. And shortages, when they're real, start to show up in ways that move public sentiment. In Crimea, following hits on the Chonhar Bridge and surrounding logistics, you got actual fuel rationing, not a reduction. Rationing. People queuing at gas stations with QR codes because the supply chain couldn't keep up. In Moscow, following the refinery strikes we're tracking right now, you're seeing longer lines at pumps, regional allocations, transport companies starting to restrict movement because fuel availability is becoming uncertain. Now, none of that is a catastrophe by itself. Russia's not collapsing from missing a third of one region's fuel. But here's where it gets interesting from an economic perspective. This isn't the kind of pressure that shows up as a single dramatic headline number. This is the kind of pressure that shows up as a gradual erosion of slack. And slack, the cushion a war economy needs to absorb shocks without the public noticing, is the thing Russia's been trying to maintain since day one. Let me pull back to the financial layer, because this is where it should actually matter to anyone watching markets, and not just military headlines. Russia's oil economy right now is doing something almost miraculous from a sanctions perspective. Despite all the restrictions, despite everything the West has tried, Russia's export earnings are elevated. We're talking about crude hovering around $80 to $85 a barrel, sometimes higher. The country's moving near record volumes, somewhere around 3.8 million barrels a day. The money's still flowing out. International Energy Agency estimated Russian oil export earnings at over $19 billion in April alone. So why would anyone care about a refinery fire? Because export earnings and domestic fuel availability are not the same thing. This is the asymmetry almost nobody's discussing. Ukraine isn't trying to stop Russian oil exports. That ship sailed years ago. Sanctions never fully choked that off. What they're targeting is something narrower, and I'd argue smarter. Domestic refining capacity. Hit the place that turns crude into the fuel ordinary Russians and Russian logistics actually run on. And you create friction inside the country without needing to touch the export revenue that keeps the war funded from outside. It's an odd kind of pressure. Quiet, structural, the kind that shows up weeks later as longer lines at gas stations in provincial cities, not as a dramatic headline number on a Bloomberg terminal. And that's deliberate. Zelensky himself has been pretty direct about the intent here, more direct than usual. He's described these strikes as long-range sanctions. That's not accidental framing. That's deliberate signaling about what's actually happening. Sanctions from the West have been slow, leaky, endlessly negotiated with waivers carved out for India and others. A drone doesn't need a waiver. A refinery doesn't renegotiate. It either works or it doesn't. So here's what I think is actually being attempted here, and it's worth sitting with because it's clever in a way that most war coverage doesn't give it credit for. Ukraine doesn't have the conventional military mass to force Russia to the table through frontline gains alone. Not right now. So instead, they're trying to make the war economically and psychologically real inside Russia's own capital. Bring the cost home, literally, to the home front. To the city where decisions get made, to the places where the elite who matter to Putin actually live and work and drive their kids to school. Because there's something about seeing fuel shortages in your own city that's different from hearing about casualties on a distant front. One you can manage through a press release, the other you can't hide from people in their daily lives. And once that psychologically shifts, once people start realizing the war isn't somewhere else anymore, it's in the fuel line at their neighborhood pump, the political pressure on whoever's running the country starts to move differently. Now here's where this connects to what matters if you're actually tracking markets and not just military developments. Fuel shortages, even partial ones, even regional ones, ripple into transport costs. Transport costs ripple into food prices. Food prices are the one thing that actually moves public sentiment inside Russia in a way the Kremlin pays close attention to. Put another way, a drone that costs maybe $3,000 to produce and successfully hits a refinery isn't just damaging a building, it's potentially affecting the inflation trajectory inside Russia for weeks afterward. It's increasing the cost of moving goods. It's increasing insurance premiums for anyone shipping anything through a country where drone strikes are becoming predictable. It's degrading the assumption of stability that foreign businesses and capital need to feel to keep operating there. This is the layer most coverage skips. People keep framing this as will Russia's economy collapse or won't it, like there's a binary outcome. But the refinery targeting tells you the real spectrum is wider and stranger. Russia's economy doesn't need to collapse for this to matter. It just needs to absorb enough friction, enough small costs, enough erosion of the slack that lets a war keep running without the average citizen feeling it directly. And here's a question worth sitting with, because I don't think it's been asked clearly enough yet. What happens to Russia's wartime financial model if domestic refining keeps getting hit at this pace? We're not talking about a single strike. We're talking about a campaign. Multiple facilities hit in recent weeks. While export revenue depends on a sanctions regime that's already full of holes anyone with a checkbook can walk through, you end up with a strange split-screen economy. Export earnings holding up, even climbing, because crude itself is fungible and buyers exist. But domestic capacity, refineries, fuel distribution, the boring, unglamorous infrastructure of actually running a country day to day getting chipped away strike by strike, that's not the kind of pressure that shows up as a dramatic single headline number. It shows up slower. It shows up as a gradual erosion of the margin. And once that margin gets small enough, every subsequent strike costs more than the one before it, because there's less spare capacity left to root around the damage. Okay, so what does this actually mean for someone watching this from the perspective of markets and not just military developments? A few things. First, watch refineries. Not just Russian ones, actually. Watch whether Ukraine sustains this targeting campaign or whether it depletes its drone stockpile and needs time to rebuild. Because if this becomes a consistent pattern over the next 3 to 6 months, it changes the baseline assumptions about Russian fuel availability and therefore inflation pressure inside Russia. That matters for ruble stability. That matters for capital flows. That matters for anyone hedging Russian economic exposure. Second, watch insurance costs. I mentioned this briefly, but it deserves its own section. Insurance for anything shipping through or doing business in Russia doesn't go down when refineries start burning. It goes up. And it stays up even after the strikes stop because insurers price risk on trend, not on individual incidents. Companies that have been quietly maintaining operations in Russia, the ones that were hedging their exposure anyway, those hedges get more expensive now. And when hedges get more expensive, some businesses decide the exposure just isn't worth it. Third, and this is maybe the most overlooked, watch energy price movements with a lag. I want to be precise about this because it's easy to overstate. Global Brent crude prices right now are being driven mostly by something completely different. The Middle East, Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, broader supply questions. Russian refinery damage doesn't move global oil prices that much, but it does move regional diesel prices. And regional price spikes, especially for diesel, which is the fuel for logistics and agriculture, they tend to show up in food price inflation in Russia with a 4 to 8 week lag. So if refineries keep getting hit through July and August, watch what happens to food price expectations in Russia heading into fall and winter. That's not an immediate trade, but it's the kind of slow-moving pressure that tends to surprise people who weren't paying attention to the underlying logistics. Here's what I'd actually watch if I were tracking this for financial purposes. Watch the repair timeline on the damaged facilities. That's the tell. If Gazprom Neft and Russia's other refinery operators get facilities back online within a couple of weeks, this was a serious but contained disruption. If they're still dark a month from now, heading into the summer peak driving season and the harvest season when agricultural demand for diesel peaks, that's a different story entirely. That's the first real crack in the idea that Russia's domestic economy can absorb this war indefinitely without the average citizen feeling it directly. Now let me be honest about what I don't know. I don't know whether Ukraine intends to sustain this targeting campaign indefinitely or whether this is a burst followed by rebuilding time. Drone production has constraints, materials have constraints, and while Norway and other European countries have pledged significant support for expanding drone production, that takes time. So I don't know if we're looking at the beginning of a sustained economic pressure campaign or a temporary surge. What I do know is that the targeting logic has shifted. The calculus has changed. Ukraine's not trying to win Crimea back through a beach assault. They're trying to make holding Crimea economically impossible. And refineries, as it turns out, are how you do that. Maybe that's the real shift underneath all the drone counts and strike reports. For most of this war, Russia's been able to tell its own population that the war was somewhere else. It was a frontline problem. And Moscow, for the most part, stayed Moscow. Lights on, malls open, life proceeding. But the moment fuel lines start forming and supply chains start tightening and insurance costs start spiking, that story gets a lot harder to maintain. The question worth sitting with isn't whether Russia survives this. It almost certainly does. This isn't an economy on the verge of collapse. The real question is what it costs them quietly in the margin to keep absorbing strikes like this every few weeks for the rest of this year, and whether that margin is shrinking faster than either side is willing to admit out loud right now. Educational disclaimer. This video provides independent geopolitical and economic analysis for informational purposes. It strictly adheres to YouTube community guidelines and does not promote or glorify violence.